If you grow old and weak, would your own child leave you behind? My name is Henry, and for most of my life, I believed that question was cruel. The kind people ask just to sound dramatic. Then my son called me one quiet evening. "Dad," he said, "let's take a drive. Just you and me. Fresh air. It'll do you good." His voice was calm, responsible, like the kind of son everyone tells you you're lucky to have. I didn't argue. At my age, you stop arguing, because you don't want to be a burden. I grabbed my coat. I sat in the passenger seat, and I trusted my son. 40 minutes later, the road turned to dirt. The cell signal disappeared, and when the car finally stopped, the forest went so silent, it felt like the whole world had agreed not to witness what came next. The drive that sounded reasonable. At 72, you learn the difference between danger and inconvenience. Danger announces itself. Inconvenience arrives wrapped in concern. My son didn't sound rushed when he called. He didn't sound nervous. He sounded prepared. "Dad," he said, "I've been thinking. You've been inside too much lately. Let's take a drive, just the two of us. Fresh air. It'll do you good." I remember looking around my living room after I hung up. The chair by the window, the clock that ticked too loudly when the house was quiet. Nothing was wrong. And that, somehow, made it easier to agree. I didn't want to be difficult. At my age, you learn that the fastest way to lose your voice is to sound like a problem. So I put on my coat, locked the door, and let my son drive. He talked the whole way out of town about work, about traffic, about how doctors worry too much these days. Every sentence was gentle, reasonable, the kind of conversation that makes you think, I raised a good man. The road narrowed. Street lights thinned out. The houses disappeared. I noticed the cell signal drop first. 1 bar. Then none. I almost said something. Almost. If you're listening right now, pause for just a moment. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I read the comments, and it helps to know who's here with me. My son turned onto a dirt road and said, casually, "It's quieter out here." That was the first time I felt it. Not fear, but the sense that a decision had already been made, without me being asked. And I kept quiet. The papers I didn't read. A few minutes into the dirt road, my son reached into the glove compartment. "Before I forget," he said, keeping his eyes on the road, "there are a couple of forms I need you to sign. Nothing serious, just updates. Makes things easier if something ever happens." He handed me a thin folder. 2 pages, neat lines, small print. I didn't recognize the names at the top, but the words safety, medical, and authorization appeared often enough to feel reassuring. He explained everything in the calm voice people use when they don't want questions. "It's mostly for emergencies," he added. "Hospitals, insurance, stuff like that." I glanced at the signature line and hesitated. For a moment, I wanted to ask why this couldn't wait. Why now? Why out here? But I remembered the look people get when you slow things down. The sigh. The patience that feels practiced. So I signed. The pen felt heavier than it should have. My son smiled, folded the papers, and slid them back into the folder like this part of the drive had been handled. "Good," he said. "That'll save us trouble later." Later, he turned up the radio low, almost polite. The trees pressed closer to the road, their branches leaning in like they were listening. I watched my name disappear back into the glove compartment and felt something shift. Not alarm, just the faint sense that I had agreed to something I didn't fully understand. Have you ever signed something because it seemed easier than saying no? Because the person asking was someone you loved? If this moment feels familiar, you're not alone. You can say that in the comments if you want just a sentence or two about a time you trusted someone and didn't ask enough questions. The car kept moving, and so did I. Forward, quiet, and officially less in control than I had been 10 minutes earlier. When concern starts making decisions. The forest grew denser as we drove. Pines replaced houses. Gravel replaced pavement. My son adjusted his speed without being asked, like he'd driven this road before. "You've been forgetting things lately," he said, still calm, still gentle. "Little stuff. Where you put your keys. Appointments. It happens." I stared out the window. "I manage," I said. "I know," he replied quickly. "I'm not saying you don't. I'm just saying people notice. Neighbors. Doctors. They worry." Worry? Such a useful word. It sounds like love, even when it's doing something else. He reached over and turned the heater down. "You get overheated easily now," he added. I hadn't mentioned being warm. That was when I realized the conversation wasn't about how I felt. It was about how I was being described. He talked about safety, about liability, about how hard it is to be responsible for someone who might not always make the best decisions. He never raised his voice. He never accused me of anything. He didn't have to. The road narrowed again, forcing us to slow. The trees closed in so tightly the sky felt thinner. I thought about interrupting him, about telling him I was still here, still listening, still capable. But when someone speaks for you long enough, it becomes harder to speak as yourself. Have you ever felt that shift? When concern quietly turns into control? If this sounds like something you've seen or lived through, you don't have to explain it fully. Sometimes just acknowledging it helps. A few words in the comments is enough. My son eased the car to a stop and put it in park. "We're here," he said. And only then did I realize he hadn't asked me where I wanted to go. The place without a name. The car idled for a moment before my son turned the engine off. The sudden quiet felt heavier than the drive itself. We were in a clearing I didn't recognize, no sign, no marker, no trailhead. Just dirt, trees, and the faint impression that this spot had been used before and then forgotten. My son stepped out first. He stretched his legs, rolled his shoulders, and looked around like someone checking the weather. "This is good," he said. "Quiet." I opened my door more slowly. The ground was uneven, softer than it looked. Cold crept up through the soles of my shoes. He walked a few steps ahead of me, then stopped and turned back. "Let me hold on to your phone for a minute," he said. "There's no signal out here anyway, and I don't want you draining the battery." I hesitated. It was a small thing, and small things are easier to give up. So I handed it to him. He slipped it into his jacket pocket without checking the screen, like this was always the plan. Then he smiled, quick, reassuring. "I'll be right back," he said. "Just need to check something." "Check what?" I asked. "Nothing to worry about," he replied. "Stay right here." He turned and walked toward the trees, his footsteps crunching softly over gravel and leaves. I watched him disappear between the trunks, the dark swallowing his outline faster than it should have. I stood there alone, listening. No cars, no voices, no signal bars returning. Just the sound of the forest breathing around me. If you've ever been told to wait without being told why, you know how long a single minute can feel. You don't have to say more than that in the comments. Sometimes one word is enough. I counted to 60, then to 100, and that was when I understood something simple and terrifying. He hadn't said when he was coming back. The minutes that didn't come back. I told myself not to overreact. That was the voice I'd learned to trust, the one that keeps you calm by calling fear imagination. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The forest didn't change, but my body did. The cold settled deeper. My knees ached from standing still, so I shifted my weight and looked toward the trees where my son had gone. Nothing moved. I called his name once. Not loudly, just enough to remind him I was there. No answer. I told myself he was nearby, that he'd be back any second with an apology and a practical explanation. He always had one. I reached instinctively for my pocket, then remembered. No phone, no signal, no way to mark time except the slow tightening in my chest. Another thought crept in, quieter than fear. He knows this place. He hadn't been lost. He hadn't been unsure. He'd driven here like it was on a map only he could see. I sat down on a fallen log to rest my legs. The bark was damp, the wood cold. The air smelled like pine and something older earth that hadn't been disturbed in a long time. If you've ever waited for someone who held all the power in that moment, you know the kind of waiting I mean. It's not patience. It's suspension. If this story feels close to home, consider passing it along to someone who might need it. Sometimes people don't realize they're not alone until they hear someone else say it first. I stood again and looked at the trees. "Son," I called, louder this time. The forest answered with silence. And that was the moment I stopped waiting for him to come back, and started wondering who, if anyone, would believe me when he didn't. When silence starts answering, I tried to stay still. Stillness feels safer when you don't know what else to do. But the silence changed. It stopped being empty, and started feeling deliberate, like something that had made room for itself. The wind moved through the branches without touching me. Somewhere far off, a bird called once and went quiet again. I checked my watch. The second hand kept moving. Time hadn't abandoned me. Only my son had. I took a few careful steps toward the trees. The ground dipped and rose unevenly, forcing me to watch my footing. Each step felt louder than it should have, as if the forest were counting them. I stopped at the edge of the clearing. Beyond it, the trees closed ranks. The path my son had taken was no longer obvious. Leaves, shadows, identical trunks, everything looked the same from here. I understood then why he'd chosen this place. Dad, he'd said earlier. Not sir. Not Henry. Dad soft enough to make resistance feel rude. My hands were numb. I tucked them into my pockets and felt the absence of my phone again, sharper this time, not just inconvenience, vulnerability. Have you ever realized too late that someone else controlled all the exits? If that question hits close, you don't have to explain it. A simple yes in the comments tells me enough. I listened harder, tried to catch the sound of footsteps returning. Nothing. I turned back toward the clearing, toward the spot where the car had been. The car was gone. No tire tracks fresh enough to follow. No dust settling. Just a wide, quiet space where something important used to be. That was when the truth settled in not as panic, but as certainty. He hadn't stepped away for a moment. He had finished what he came to do. The shape of being left. I stood where the car had been and tried to make sense of the space it left behind. A rectangle of pressed dirt. A few broken twigs. Evidence so ordinary, it almost felt insulting. I turned in a slow circle, taking inventory the way my father once taught me to do in emergencies. Jacket, watch, wallet. No phone. No cues. No way to call anyone who still knew my name. I called out again, louder, now. The sound didn't travel far. It rose, bent, and fell back on me like it didn't want to leave either. My breathing changed. Not panic. Not yet. Something tighter. More careful. I pictured what my son would say when someone asked where I was. He would sound worried. He would use the right words. Dad insisted. Dad gets confused. I tried to stop him. The story was already writing itself somewhere far away, warm and well lit. I took a few steps toward the road, then stopped. Without landmarks, every direction felt like a guess. And guessing is dangerous when you don't know how long you'll be guessing for. If you've ever felt replaced by a version of yourself someone else controls, you know how disorienting that is. You don't need to say much, just knowing others recognize it matters. I leaned against a tree to steady myself. The bark was rough, real. I pressed my palm into it and focused on the sensation, grounding myself in something that hadn't lied to me. Somewhere beyond the trees, my son was driving radio on, windows up, rehearsing the concern he'd show later. I could almost hear him, and standing there, alone in that clearing, I understood something I'd never been forced to face before. Being left behind isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly. The moment you realize the person you trusted most made sure no one would hear you disappear. The first voice that wasn't his. I don't know how long I stood there before I heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the forest. Footsteps, careful, measured. I turned slowly, afraid of being wrong again. A man stepped into the clearing from the far side, wearing a jacket too light for the cold and a cap pulled low. He stopped when he saw me, surprise flashing across his face. "Sir?" he called. "Are you okay?" The question caught me off guard, not because it was kind, but because it was direct. No assumptions, no corrections, no speaking for me. "I think I've been left," I said. The words felt strange, but solid as they left my mouth. He looked past me, then back again, scanning the empty space where a car should have been. "Did someone bring you out here?" "My son," I said. Saying it out loud made the silence heavier. The man's jaw tightened not dramatically, just enough to show he was listening. "I'm a volunteer ranger," he said. "I was checking trail markers. You're not supposed to be here this late." He asked if I needed water, if I was hurt, if I could walk. Each question returned something I hadn't realized I was losing. Agency. He didn't ask if I was confused. He didn't ask who was responsible for me. If someone has ever finally listened to you after a long stretch of being spoken over, you know the relief I mean. If that's happened to you, you can say so in the comments, no details needed. The ranger radioed for assistance. As he did, he glanced at me and said quietly, "You're safe now." I believed him, not because he promised anything, but because he hadn't decided who I was before I answered. When safety feels temporary. The ranger offered his arm as we walked. Not to pull me, not to rush me, just enough to steady the ground beneath my feet. We moved slowly, the way people do when they're not pretending time doesn't matter. His radio crackled once, then again. Voices I couldn't hear clearly answered him from somewhere far away. He told me help was coming. He didn't say how long it would take. I nodded, though my mind was already somewhere else, following the road back in my head, counting turns I hadn't paid attention to on the way in. I kept thinking about my phone, about how easy it would have been for my son to call this in differently. Dad wandered off. Dad gets turned around sometimes. The ranger led me to a small utility cabin near the trailhead. Inside, the air was warmer. He handed me a bottle of water and waited while I drank, giving me space without leaving. "Do you know your son's number?" he asked gently. I did. Of course I did. I had memorized it years ago, back when numbers mattered more than contact names. He wrote it down. "We'll reach out," he said, "just to let him know you're safe." Safe. The word landed oddly, like it belonged to someone else's story. Have you ever noticed how quickly being found can turn into being explained? If that shift feels familiar, you don't have to unpack it here. A quiet acknowledgement is enough. As the heater hummed, I realized something unsettling. The forest wasn't the dangerous part. What came next? The version of events my son would tell, and how easily it might be believed. That was what scared me, because I wasn't lost. I had been placed. The story that arrived before I did. The ranger stepped outside to make the call. I stayed where I was, hands wrapped around the bottle, watching my breath fog the window. When he came back in, his expression had changed, not alarmed, not angry. "Careful. I spoke to your son," he said. "He's concerned." Concerned? The same word my son had used on the drive out. "He said you asked to get out of the car," the ranger continued. "Said you wanted some space, fresh air." He paused. "He mentioned you've been having some memory trouble." I felt something sink, not my stomach, but my standing, as if the ground beneath me had quietly lowered. "That's not what happened," I said. The ranger nodded once. "I hear you. Not I understand. Not we'll see. Just, I hear you." He explained the next steps. Paperwork. A report. A ride back to town. Routine words. Neutral words. But I could already see how they'd look when written down. Elder male, found alone in restricted area. Family notified. No immediate signs of distress. If you've ever realized your truth was being summarized into something smaller and easier to manage, you know that feeling. It's not anger. It's erosion. A vehicle pulled up outside, headlights sweeping across the cabin like a searchlight. The ranger said my son was on his way. That was when I understood the real danger. It wasn't that he'd left me in the forest. It was that he'd arrived everywhere else first. And by the time I walked back into the light, the version of me people expected to see was already decided. When the truth needs help to stand, my son arrived with his headlights on high, like he wanted the whole scene illuminated. He stepped out quickly, concern already arranged on his face. "Dad," he said, "relief first, then worry. You scared me." He thanked the ranger, asked the right questions, apologized for the trouble. Every word landed exactly where it was meant to. "I told him you've been having some rough nights," he added gently, as if he were protecting me from myself. The ranger glanced at me, not accusing, not convinced, waiting. I felt the urge to interrupt, to correct him sentence by sentence. But when someone else controls the context, interruptions sound like symptoms. So I didn't argue. I described the drive, the dirt road, the phone he took. I kept my voice steady and my details small, the way people do when they want to be believed. The ranger wrote everything down. Have you ever noticed how the truth changes weight depending on who carries it? If that's something you've felt before, you can say so, no explanation needed. My son watched me carefully, measuring. Not angry, not afraid. Just alert, like someone making sure the story stayed within safe limits. When the ranger finished, he closed the notebook and looked at both of us. "We'll follow up," he said, "separately." Separately, that single word gave the truth somewhere to stand. As we drove back toward town, my son at the wheel again, I stared out at the dark and understood something I hadn't before. Being left in the forest was only the first test. The harder one would be convincing the world that I hadn't wandered there on my own. The file that quietly replaced me. Back home, the house felt unchanged, and that made everything worse. The chair by the window was where I'd left it. The clock still ticked too loudly, but something invisible had moved in while I was gone. There was an envelope on the kitchen table. County letterhead. My name typed neatly across the front. Inside were copies forms I now recognized. Authorization, medical consent, temporary power to act on my behalf. The papers I hadn't read. According to the file, my son hadn't abandoned me. He had managed a situation. According to the file, I wasn't left. I was assisted. Have you ever seen your life reduced to checkboxes someone else filled in? If that sounds familiar, you don't need to explain it here. A nod in the comments is enough. I sat down and felt the weight of it, not fear this time, but clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a system already in motion. My phone buzzed with messages from relatives. He's doing his best. You're lucky to have such a caring son. I didn't reply, because I understood something then that I hadn't in the forest. Once a story is written into a file, it doesn't need witnesses anymore. The proof that didn't speak loudly. The next morning, I drove back toward the forest with someone who knew how to read between lines. Frank had retired from the county sheriff's office years ago. He moved slower now, the way men do when they've learned speed isn't the point. He didn't ask many questions. He listened. At the clearing, he crouched near the dirt and traced a line with his finger. Tire marks, he said, recent, came in, left fast. He walked the edge of the road, stopped near a cluster of rocks, and pointed. Your phone, he said quietly. It was cracked, half buried in leaves, power drained, screen dark. Not lost, discarded. Frank photographed everything. The marks, the timestamps, the location. None of it dramatic. None of it emotional. That was the problem. Truth doesn't announce itself. It waits to be noticed. If you've ever had to collect proof just to be taken seriously, you know how heavy that is. You don't have to explain, just knowing others recognize it matters. Frank straightened and looked at me. He planned this, he said, and he thought no one would check. As we left the clearing, I realized something that steadied me. The forest hadn't erased me. It had preserved the truth. And for the first time since the drive, I knew I wasn't the only one who could see it. When belief begins to shift. By the time we got back to town, the story had already spread, just not the right one. A neighbor stopped me outside the grocery store. Your son's been so worried, she said kindly. You gave him quite a scare. I thanked her and kept walking. Concern travels faster than truth because it doesn't ask for proof. It only asks for a familiar face. That evening, Frank laid everything out on my kitchen table. The photos, the timestamps, the location data pulled from a traffic camera near the highway entrance. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just consistency. This doesn't match his version, Frank said. Not cleanly. That was the first crack not in my son's story, but in how easily it held together. We didn't rush. Frank taught me that haste makes truth look defensive. Instead, we let the evidence exist. We let it wait. If you've ever learned that staying calm is sometimes the only way to be believed, you know how difficult that patience is. If that resonates, you can share a word or two below. Many people listening will understand without details. 2 days later, a county officer called to ask a follow-up question. Then another. My son stopped calling altogether. Silence, I learned, can mean many things. Sometimes it's power. Sometimes it's retreat. I sat by the window that night and realized something quietly hopeful. For the first time since the drive, I wasn't trying to prove I was sane. I was letting the truth speak, and watching to see who was finally ready to listen. The money that moved without me. The bank statement arrived, folded inside another envelope, like it didn't want to be seen. I sat at the table and read it slowly. Not because it was complicated, but because I already knew what I would find. Small transfers, careful amounts, never enough to trigger alarms, always enough to add up. Frank leaned over my shoulder, silent. He let me reach the number myself. Since when? I asked. Months, he said. Started right after the medical forms. The timing settled in my chest like a weight. Concern first. Authorization second. Control last. I called the bank, asked questions I'd never had to ask before. They answered politely, the way people do when they believe they're helping. Yes, sir, your son has temporary authority. Yes, sir, it's all documented. Yes, sir, it's for your protection. Protection. Have you ever noticed how easily protection can sound like permission? If that distinction matters to you, you're not alone. Many listening here have felt it too. Frank pointed to a line item I'd missed. An account I didn't recognize. An address I'd never used. He didn't just move your money, Frank said. He moved your future. I folded the paper and slid it back into the envelope. Not out of fear, out of resolve. Because this wasn't about dollars anymore. It was about something quieter and far more dangerous. A son who believed that once the paperwork was in place, I would be too small to matter. The calm before he realized. I didn't confront my son right away. Frank told me not to. When someone thinks they're in control, he said, they get careless. So I waited. Days passed, then a week. My son sent a message that sounded almost generous. Let me handle things for now. Focus on resting. Resting. Another word that sounds kind until it replaces your choices. I replied once, short, neutral. Thank you. I'm fine. Frank helped me lock down what I could, new passwords, alerts, quiet safeguards that didn't announce themselves. We didn't reverse anything yet. We watched. Have you ever learned that patience isn't about waiting? It's about letting someone reveal who they think you are now? My son called one evening, voice lighter than it had been in days. Everything's under control, he said. You don't need to worry anymore. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was clear. He believed the forest had worked, that the paperwork had finished the job, that I would stay quiet because that's what people my age are expected to do. If you're listening and you've ever felt underestimated simply because of your age, you can acknowledge that below. You don't have to explain it. Many will recognize it instantly. When we hung up, Frank looked at me and nodded. That's it, he said. He thinks he's won. And that was when we moved. Not loudly, not dramatically, just deliberately. The way truth has to move, when it's been ignored once already. The question he didn't prepare for. I asked my son to come over the next evening. Nothing urgent, nothing emotional. Just, we should talk. He arrived calm, too calm. He looked around the house like someone checking on something already settled. How are you holding up, Dad? He asked, lowering his voice. You've been through a lot. Better, I said. Thanks to you. That sentence did exactly what I needed it to do. His shoulders relaxed. He sat down. I didn't accuse him. I didn't raise my voice. I asked one question. Why were you so sure everyone would believe you? He frowned slightly. Not confused, caught off guard. You didn't just leave me out there, I continued. You called it in. You prepared paperwork. You told people I wasn't safe. I met his eyes. Why were you so confident it would work? He sighed, like a patient man dealing with a difficult problem. Dad, he said, you're getting older. People expect things to happen. Memory lapses, confusion. People, I said quietly. Or you? His jaw tightened. You're reading too much into this, he replied. At your age, everything feels bigger than it is. There it was. Not anger, not regret, but certainty. Certainty that his voice outweighed mine. If you've ever been dismissed, not because you were wrong, but because you were old, you know how that lands. If this moment feels familiar, you can acknowledge it in the comments. You don't have to explain. I nodded once. Not in agreement. In understanding. Because in that moment, my son didn't realize he was confessing. But he had just answered the only question that mattered. When evidence speaks without me, I didn't raise my voice after that conversation. I didn't need to. Frank came by the next morning with a small recorder and a folder that looked heavier than it was. Inside were copies, bank records, call logs, timestamps from a traffic camera near the forest entrance. None of it dramatic. None of it emotional. That's what made it dangerous. We sat at my kitchen table while he explained it slowly, the way you do when the truth no longer needs persuasion. He called it in before you were found, Frank said. That matters. He pointed to a timestamp. He described you as confused before anyone asked. I stared at the numbers. They didn't accuse. They didn't sympathize. They just existed. Have you ever noticed how facts don't argue? They wait. If you've ever had to rely on proof instead of being believed, you already understand that silence. Frank slid one page closer to me. Here's the part that changes things. It was a location log from the car. Arrival time. Departure time. The gap was longer than my waiting. Long enough to be deliberate. He didn't forget you, Frank said quietly. He timed it. I leaned back in my chair and felt something settle. Not relief, not anger. Clarity. Because in that moment I understood something simple. I didn't need to convince anyone anymore. The story my son built couldn't stand on its own. And soon, he wouldn't be the one deciding. Who sounded believable. The moment he was no longer in control. They didn't arrest him that day. They didn't need to. A detective called and asked him to come in to clarify a few details. That was enough. He stopped answering my messages. Stopped telling people I was confused. Stopped managing anything at all. Silence returned, but this time it wasn't mine. I sat alone in my living room and understood something quietly important. The forest didn't expose my weakness. It exposed his certainty. And certainty, once questioned, is a very fragile thing. What I chose to keep, I don't tell this story because it ended cleanly. It didn't. My son's case moved slowly, the way truth does when it finally enters a room that prefers quiet. Lawyers spoke. Forms multiplied. People asked careful questions instead of easy ones. No one applauded. No one apologized to me in public. Life resumed unevenly. I changed my routines first. New passwords, new alerts, a different bank. I learned, at an age when you're not supposed to learn new systems, how to protect the parts of your life that had always felt too small to guard. Not out of fear, out of respect for myself. Some evenings I still sit by the window, the same chair, the same clock. What's different is the silence. It no longer feels like something done to me. It feels chosen. People ask if I hate my son. I don't know how to answer questions that want a clean emotion. I love the boy I raised. I don't excuse the man he became. Those two truths can exist in the same body without canceling each other out. What surprised me most wasn't the forest, or the paperwork, or how easily people believed him at first. It was how many strangers wrote to me afterward, people who recognized the quiet warning signs long before a road turned to dirt. They told me about decisions made for them, about concern that slowly replaced consent, about the moment they realized their voice had been filed away as inconvenient. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of a conversation you've been avoiding, or a silence you've been living inside, don't keep it there. Stories like this don't spread because they're dramatic. They spread because someone needs to hear, "You're not imagining it." Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Tell me honestly what part of this stayed with you. Your words matter more than you think, and I read them. And if you want a place where these stories are told without shouting, without rushing you to feel something you're not ready for, you're welcome to stay here. Because sometimes the most important thing an older voice can do is refuse to disappear quietly and make room for others to be heard before they do. Henry,